Hey y'all, I'm Reese, and welcome to Making Meaning. Making Meaning is a podcast by the Cohere Collective and is here to guide you along your path to make meaning in a way that makes sense for you by sharing an array of meaning-making stories. This week, I chat with author and Bioneers co-founder Nina Simons about her wonderful book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. Our truly rich conversation spans so many different topics, covers just the tip of the iceberg of this book, and we dive into activism, self-growth, our connection to nature, and plenty of other topics. There's a little something for everyone in this one. Nina's book won the 2018 Nautilus Award in gold for the women category and the award in silver for the social change and social justice category. If you want more of Nina, you can discover her on Instagram at @1NinaSimons, and even more of her work is at www.ninasimons.com. So let's take a deep breath and get started. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and chat with me this beautiful Wednesday afternoon. I hope it's as beautiful over outside of Santa Fe as it is in Dallas this afternoon, but I appreciate your time and energy being here. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure, and it is a beautiful afternoon here. We just had a little sprinkle of rain, which in the high desert where I live is always a blessing,
right?
And makes the desert smell amazing. So I'm in gratitude.
Oh, how fun. I've never been to New Mexico, and I'm like, I should definitely go. I've heard it's beautiful. So that's great to hear. To kick us off, the first question I always like to ask all my guests is just one thing you're grateful for. A nice, simple question to help us start on the right foot, and whatever the first thing that pops to mind is perfect. It does not have to be fancy at all.
You know, I'm grateful for the gift of mother life, and I just completed a board meeting for the organization that I've been co-shepherding for 34 years, and I'm grateful to have found my way into work that nourishes my soul.
Absolutely. I think that as a young person who very much values that kind of work and has seen different life paths that my peer cohorts have all taken, it's rare, even for young people, to find work that nourishes their soul, and it takes bravery to do that. So that is really wonderful. My second question that will kind of open up this conversation for us a little bit, and of course ties us into your wonderful book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. But I'm just going to ask you, what is your story? Feel free to share whatever portion of that you would want to, whatever you feel called to say in this moment is exactly right.
Thank you. Wow. Let's see. Because I'm in the middle of designing a course on sacred activism, I want to tell my story through that lens, because what has been startling to me as I review the trajectory of my life work is that every major change or shift or evolution of my path has been informed by a kind of spiritual guidance and some sort of a moment of aha. And so I assumed in my early life that my contribution would be through the arts, because my parents were both artists, and I loved the arts, and especially live theater. And So I immersed myself in that. And then as I discovered how hard it might be to earn a living at the kind of theater that I really believed in,
Right.
which challenged people's belief systems and was not just entertainment, I got kind of disillusioned. I took my mother up on an offer to study for a weekend with a spiritual school for consciousness that she was involved in called Eureka, that was started by a Bolivian mystic, and spent about 5 years doing all their trainings.
Wow.
And then when I came to visit her in Santa Fe, New Mexico, I felt called to move there. I was living in New York City at the time, and all my friends said, "Are you kidding? You're moving where your mother is? You've been so happy being across the country from her." And I had to say, well, I can't not move there because she's there. And fair enough, right?
Fair enough.
And so I did wind up moving here, and I really felt called by the land. I felt like there was some sort of historical memory in the land that had been occupied by humans for so very long, and also that the land had a particularly feminine quality to me. And I couldn't, it wasn't a rational awareness, but I felt it in my body and in my bones. And so I moved to New Mexico and embarked on a 5-year process to reconcile the issues that I had had with my mother for so long, so that we could live in the same town and I could not be kind of obsessed with my relationship with her. And thankfully, she was someone who was really open to all kinds of ways of perceiving and philosophizing and learning. And so we did shamanic work and we did all kinds of work together. And I disentangled my own psyche enough from her so that I was able to have a very loving relationship with her until her death about 3.5 years ago. And I always felt really proud of myself that I took that on so completely and that we were successful at it. And then, so soon after I moved here, actually a few years after I moved here, I met my life partner, and that partnership wound up opening all kinds of possibilities for me. The first was that when I first met him, he was finishing a documentary film about the politics of cancer therapy, of all things, and the history of medicine. And I didn't know anything about all that, but his father had recently died, and soon after his father died of cancer, he started learning about the existence of alternatives that were not widely known or accessible. And as we're living in a time where there's more and more cancer, unfortunately, which many people believe is directly related to the environmental toxicity we've accumulated,
Right.
That work really sparked me. And he had been working on this film for like 4 or 5 years when we first met, and he was getting phone calls at all hours of the day and night from people who'd just been diagnosed with cancer, who's called up to say, "I'm terrified, and I heard through the grapevine that you might know something about options for treatment." And I felt like, my heart said, "Oh my gosh, this is so important. How do we get this information more widely out there?" So I worked with him to complete and market the film. And we just found that working together was an incredible joy. And as he puts it, we were like peanut butter and jelly. It was just, it was easeful, and we were complimentary, and it was a good scene. And then he was invited to come and film a biodiversity garden in southern New Mexico. And I, having grown up in the city, knew nothing about farming or gardening, thought I was going for a weekend in the country. And when we got there, we had this tour through the most beautiful garden I'd ever seen. And as we walked through the garden, the master gardener who was tending it would introduce us to each plant, and he would say its common name and its Latin name and how it was related to all the plants around it. And I began to realize that this man knew these plants better than a lot of people know their own families. And there were hundreds and hundreds of very diverse and unusual plants living in close proximity to each other. And I began to realize as we walked through it that not only was it the most beautiful garden visually that I'd ever seen, but all my senses started getting engaged, because there were sunflowers that were like 8 feet tall and had foot diameter heads that felt like they watched us as we walked through the garden, and there were pollinators all over, and the colors were beautiful and the smells were amazing. And then he invited us to taste as we walked through the garden.
Wow.
And I was, tasting herbs I'd never heard of, like lemon licorice mint and chocolate basil. And, my senses were ecstatic, actually. And I remembered that as a child, nature had always been where I went for solace. And when life was really chaotic and turbulent and I wasn't sure how to restore my equilibrium, I went to nature. So then this master gardener named Gabriel Howarth started explaining to us why he was growing this garden, and that it was to protect the biodiversity of life itself and of our food plants in particular.
Wow.
And the reason he was protecting them was because multinational corporations were gobbling up little mom and pop seed companies, and as a result, the range of biodiversity options was shrinking really fast. And he said, look, for the survival of life on Earth, this is really vital. And by the time I walked out of that garden, I felt like the spirit of the natural world tapped me on the shoulder and said, you're working for me now. And it was an unmistakable call.
Yeah.
And I went home and quit my job at the Santa Fe Chamber Music Festival and went to work for Seeds of Change, where I worked my butt off for about 5 years and was promoted to be president of the company, and embarked on the steepest learning curve of my life, because I didn't have a business degree. I didn't know anything about farming and seed farming and about creating a business and social entrepreneurship. I learned it all as I went, and thankfully I'm a quick study, so I learned a lot fast. And then, I'm sorry this is taking so long.
No,
Just
oh my
2 or 3
goodness.
quick
Please do not
chapters.
apologize. Please keep going.
Okay. It's a windy road.
It
my
is.
life.
It is.
Next was Kenny was doing all this research about biodiversity and bioremediation, which is the science of how we remove toxins from our air and soil and water. And he was discovering that there were all these amazing people who had discovered really cool ways to effectively work with nature to heal nature. And one day he was in a hot tub with a friend, and he was bemoaning the fact that these people who were amazing, that no one had ever heard of them, and that their work was so important to our collective future. And this friend said, why don't you have a conference? And Kenny said, I've never been to a conference. It sounds boring. Why would I do that? And the friend said, here's a grant for $10,000. Go have a conference.
Wow.
And Kenny came to me, because I had a theater background, and said, will you help me make a conference? And neither of us had any reference point. And so we co-created something that to this day is still quite unusual. And it integrates everything in the natural world, including everything in the human world, in the recognition that it's all one system, interconnected and interdependent. And amazingly, it's a nonprofit organization that is about to celebrate our 35th year in existence. And we've continued to evolve and morph and change with the times. And now Bioneers is also a media company, so we produce a lot of media. And then one day, a few years into Bioneers, my father had died, and I was very brokenhearted. And a friend turned me onto a video. This dates me and tells you how long ago it was. She had a video shop, and she loaned me this video, and she said, I don't charge for this because I think it's so important. And the video, the film, is called The Burning Times. And when I saw The Burning Times, which is available online, it's a Canadian film that was made in 1990. It tells the story of the 300 to 400 year period in European history, where somewhere between 50,000 and many millions of women were systematically hunted and persecuted and tortured, and many of them burned for the supposed crime of being witches. And when I saw that, it was the first time a whole bunch of things made sense to me. Reese, it was the first time that I understood why I had some irrational fear of speaking my truth in public. Right?
Yeah.
And it was also the first time that all of the impending crises that I knew about from pioneers could be seen through one lens, which was the imbalance of the masculine and the feminine. Not just in terms of embodied people, but in terms of the archetypal principles of the yin and the yang, of those complementary human aspects, which of course ancient philosophies have long seen as requiring interdependence and full balance. And what I learned about as a result of that film was that 7 generations of children watched as all the women in their lives were endangered, and they were wrapped up in systems of societal and civilizational change that systematically undervalued everything associated with the feminine and elevated everything associated with the masculine. And it was also the first time that I fully came to grips with the fact that I had not come out of college onto a level playing field. And I realized, like, oh, how many board meetings have I been in where I've made a suggestion and it's fallen on deaf ears, and then when a guy says it, everybody goes, oh, what a good idea. So that really sent me on a path of exploring gender equity and women's leadership, and how my own gender had affected my sense of my own possibilities. And then there's one further big branch on the tree, or maybe 2, but which has to do with racial equity and indigeneity and spirituality. And really, each of those things awakened in me at different times.
Sure.
Pioneers has always had indigeneity at its heart, which we have both an indigenous program that's led by indigenous peoples, but also the idea that everyone is indigenous to Mother Earth, no matter what race or class or where we're from or what our family history is. We are all indigenous to Mother Life. And I've had the gift of being mentored by a lot of amazing leaders, many of them indigenous. And because a lot of the work, because of my big aha about gender, I spent about 20 years co-hosting and convening diverse women leaders of every age and ethnicity and background and orientation and discipline. And through that process, I realized how growing up through systems of white supremacy have jaded my perception and given me blinders, And so I've become a rather fierce advocate of racial equity and class equity and rebalancing our systems, and also applying a spiritual lens that says we have to change ourselves inwardly in order to change the world. So, that was long-winded, but that's the best I got.
No, and your best is exactly what I wanted. That was absolutely perfect. Thank you for going there and sharing that. There's so many powerful avenues that I think all of us can learn from, right? And I really love the way you talk about these different things awakening in you as you go, right? Because we all have such multitudes within us, and you don't get to discover them all at once. And that's part of kind of this path, is that as you experience new things, these different dimensions of self can grow. But then I think that your journey also really mirrors what you preach a lot. And I say preach in the non-religious sense, but of honoring intersectionality within us, within our communities, and that by being able to reflect on our own journey as being intersectional, I think you can so much better honor that in other people as well. So thank you for sharing that. I want to go back to a few things that you brought up. Firstly, how you wanted to approach telling your story from a place of sacred activism. I think that that's really powerful. And the older I get, the more, which of course there's still so much for me to learn, but the more I realize how important that really is in the way we live our life, is to do it from the perspective of serving others, right? And in the beginning of your book, you talk a little bit about returning to this, because this lovely copy that I have is the second edition. So of course the first one came out in 2019, and the second edition came out, correct me if I'm wrong, but about a year ago, correct? Tell me what it was like returning to this work after the incredible changes, incredible in the sense of vast changes, that our world and community has seen in the span of those 3 years. Obviously, we're 2023 now, but I feel like 2019 to 2022 and even now is just a time of historic change. And so returning to a work such as this one, I imagine the ideas of activism and serving others had to have kind of shifted for you. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, for the sake of framing and clarity, I guess I would say first that the opportunity to make a second edition happened because I got a grant in support of my doing that. And that was an amazing, surprising thing, which I was really excited and called to do, because the first edition came out as I was tending my mother's end of life. And so as a result, I had no time, no money, no energy to put into getting the word out. And so I felt like something that I cared about deeply, that was intended as an offering to the world, just never found its place. And so the opportunity for a second edition, part of what it meant for me was that I could weave together two parts of my life. Because at the same time, and I think for me, I consider my life working towards coherence, so, which is why I especially appreciate your work. And so for all these years, for 20 years, I hosted these deep dive, intensive, embodied retreats for women, during which I learned so much. And of course, the old adage that we teach what we most need to learn became incredibly vivid to me, because every single time I hosted a retreat, I learned volumes from the women who were there with me. And so it became an environment of mutual learning. And the opportunity to make a second edition meant that I could weave in discussion guides and embodied practices that I had learned from those 20 years with the talks and essays that I had written over the same 20 years of Pioneers. So it really became an opportunity to sort of bring my wholeness into this work in a way that I didn't feel that I had before. But the other thing that feels important to say to your very astute question, Reese, is that as the pandemic shut everything down, I felt a very strong call to go inward. And many of my sources of guidance were reinforcing that. And there were rituals, and I had a year-long mentorship with a species that I was guided to develop. That was an amazing experience. We also weathered in New Mexico the largest wildfire in northern New Mexico's history.
Wow.
And it was not very far from my forested home. And as a result, I learned about rituals to help invite the land and express gratitude and prayer to the land for holding us in the ways that it does. And I engaged in all sorts of deepening of my own spiritual practices because I really felt the need to. And I think what folks may relate to also was that whole period of time, there was this increasing chatter and distractibility in the world, right? And
Absolutely.
The political scene and the health scene and the inequity and the violence. I mean, there was so much going on. And my beloved partner is a news hound. So, I had to find a way to strengthen my own sense of center and of listening and of guidance when all that was accelerating all around us. And so that was another impetus for strengthening myself inwardly in the name of spiritual activism.
Yeah, absolutely. So continuing along that vein, because I tend to agree with you that the more that we strengthen ourselves and grow ourselves, the more we really are growing the world, the communities around us, because our cup gets bigger, there's more we're able to pour into other communities and people. But another thing that you bring up in your book is the importance of healing both as that individual and healing relationally institutions. And this is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, especially is what is our role as an individual, especially in a community that has so many institutions that in America, at least, we are an institution run socio-political economic system. What are the ways that you personally practice, but also suggest other people practice healing that relational, or I guess relationship with institution?
Well, what an interesting question, Reese. I wouldn't say that we're institution run as much as that we are corporate run. I believe we are living in a time of sort of extinction blasts of corporate power and also monopolistic power. And my sense is, that we are at an inflection point where everything is up for reinvention. And although the mainstream media mostly carries the bad news about how horribly things are falling apart and are corrupted and are being misused and manipulated and all that, because of Bioneers, I'm so thankful that I am really tapped into the world that's being born. And there is extraordinary work being done on almost every level. It's just the mainstream media doesn't cover it so much. So my sense is that I would never profess to tell anybody where and how they should engage with the massive changes that are needed.
Sure.
Right? But like you, I am invested in everyone doing their own work to find their own sense of calling or purpose. So that serving what you most love and want to protect or defend is part of my definition of purpose. And also it includes an element that speaks to what you were referencing before about how self-care and self-nourishment and being true to the entirety of our human selves is a service to the world.
Yes.
And I think for me, some of that is connected to how even language itself is being reinvented, because,
Absolutely.
I don't look for how much impact I'm having. I look for how much influence I'm having, because we've inherited all these words that are aggressive and violent and, right?
Absolutely.
I don't want to be triggered. I mean, no one wants to be triggered, but
Right.
but let's not use a gun word, right? I mean,
yeah.
So I think that, yes, there is great power in institutions. I was just reading a data survey that said that the nonprofit sector is now the second largest work sector and employer in this country after corporations.
Wow.
And now that includes health institutions and a lot of university institutions, but still, that was fascinating. And the gender pay gap is less bad in the nonprofit sector than in the corporate sector, significantly. And so there are all these trends that are happening slowly but surely, and labor movements, and I think we each have to be very discerning about, with all these possibilities of reinvention all around us, what are the one or two that really most call us? And to me, that's the call to leadership, which of course we're all redefining every day as well.
Absolutely. I love that you brought up language, because linguistics is just so, one, just fascinating to me, but two, it is the only tool we have to try and connect with one another in a discursive way, right? Like, of course, there's so many other tools that we can communicate with, but language is kind of our home as a speaking species, as a writing and storytelling species. And you talk a lot about story in your book as well. And I think that language is a really big part of story. And if we don't have the appropriate language, or whatever language we have, is inherently changing the way our story is told, which changes the story itself, right? So I think that is absolutely an extremely vital part of this entire kind of equation that we are traversing. So I want to put a pin in that and come back to it in just a moment. But to kind of continue along this conversation of being an individual and taking on this self-care, but also wanting to be an active member and leader of reinvention and really driving that positive change. Talk to me a little bit about the balance between these two things, and the balance between taking time for oneself, but also giving back, and the tension that kind of exists, and the call to do both of these things.
Well, and not only both, but many of these things, right? I mean,
absolutely.
For everyone who is parenting, I have come to believe that parenting is one of the most amazing forms of leadership there is, even though it's not been conventionally described that way. And similarly, there are many of us who are in the sandwich generation who are tending for elders at the same time as raising kids. Holy cow. So there you're trying to balance self-care with world care, with parenting and end of life care.
Right.
That's just crazy. and so I think the first thing I would say is to recognize that I don't have the solution. I'm working on it all the time. And it requires a certain amount of self-awareness to be able to know when you've gone over a line or when you've overcommitted. I'm currently working with a pattern in myself which many listeners may relate to, of over committing and over productivity and having a to-do list that's way too long, and then feeling kind of exhausted and breathless because I can never get to the end of my to-do list. Right? So
Yep.
I have this big appetite, and it's bigger than my capacity.
Yeah.
And as I work to change that, I was telling a friend about it, and I said, have you ever experienced that when you're just at the trying to finish a pattern that you know you've had for a long time, suddenly the pattern comes up bigger exponentially than ever before? And she cracked up and she said, yeah, social scientists have a name for that. They call it an extinction burst. And
Wow.
it's been making me laugh all ever since for 2 weeks, because I see extinction bursts everywhere.
Yeah.
In our, right?
Yeah.
In our governance, in our political life, in our economic life, in our, yeah. So, I
Wow.
think I used to refer to it as the dying dinosaur's tale of patriarchy was doing as much destruction as it could on its way out.
Right.
And now I have a social scientist name for it.
Wow. That is so fascinating to me in both how that applies to the inner self, right? Like you were saying, when you are kind of healing this one thing that you were working on internally, it has this really big kind of flare up before you can really move past it. But absolutely seeing reflections of that in the world around us, that is what a beautifully poignant and concise way to capture that. Wow. Okay, to return a little bit to this storytelling piece, as I was reading your book and the portions on it that bring up story and the importance of sharing story, this is a little bit of a pivot from what we were just talking about, but one of my most impactful books that I've ever read is The Truth About Stories, a Native Narrative by Thomas King. And the things he discusses in his book really reminded me a lot about your work with indigeneity, but also with, self-healing and community healing. And one quote that he has from this book is, "Do the stories we tell reflect the world as it truly is, or have we simply started off with the wrong story?" And so I would just like to ask you that question. Of course, I don't think there's a perfect answer for it. King does not answer it within his novel. I don't know if it's a question that can be answered, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Oh, it's a wonderful quote. And let's see, what are my thoughts on it? Well, my thoughts are that, to find congruence in our lives, I've found for myself that I have had to, and am continuing to, peel away layer after layer after layer of conditioning. And that conditioning determines how I see the world.
Yeah.
How it determines the story through which I filter the world, right? And, one of my favorite quotes that I refer to often is from Fritjof Capra, who is an Austrian physicist. And he says that the transformation into an eco-literate society, one that knows how to live in harmony with the natural world, requires a shift from a focus on counting things to a focus on mapping relationship.
Wow.
Right? And so, for me, one of those ideas that feels really important is, I learned from a traditional elder that in Cherokee, there is no word for love of an object. Anyone who is considered to love an object is considered to be insane. Because only things with life energy in them are relatable, really, right? And now that's interesting when it comes to elements and the rock people and the water people and all that. But again, the story our culture has us come in with has a very limited view. And what I have found is that there are indigenous practices that are helping me to deepen my quality of relationship with the non-human world, and that I'm finding very, very helpful. And Reese, there's one thing I want to go back. There's a thread I want to go back and pull on.
Absolutely, please do.
Okay, what you asked me about balance, and what I realized I didn't say that I wanted to say is that, hard though it is, I think an essential ingredient in finding our ways toward balance has to do with self-love and self-acceptance and self-valuation. And that, as we can come to perceive ourselves as the instruments of our purpose, right? I mean, my biggest prayer to myself has always been, may I live what my soul brought me here to be. And may I live it fully. And, in order to do that, I have had to strip away a lot of self-limiting beliefs, of self-judgment, of, many, many aspects of myself that have never previously felt safe to reveal or express or appreciate. And so I think that quest to find balance in our lives between all the things that pull on us, for one thing, it becomes a question of what is truly ours to do. And which is a great question to ask.
Absolutely.
And it changes, you were remarking about how my sense of meaning and my purpose in my life has continued to evolve and change. And I tend to think of it as either a tree or a river that has new branches and new rivulets, and that's, because life is change.
Absolutely.
And so I just wanted to name that because there are practices that I talk about in my book about how to both strip away the conditioned responses that have us keep ourselves small, and also how to begin to practice self-appreciation and self-love in ways that are not hallmarky, but are real,
Right. Well, in thinking about what you said about love, how true love, defining true is complicated, right? But not this, love of an object, but love. I agree. It has to be with something that you can relate to. It's a relational, it's an exchange. It is a back and forth. It is not a one-way energy flow. It is a connective regenerative system, absolutely, that you have with whoever, something energetically else, right? But to think of self-love as this regenerative system as well, how do we align this flow of love within ourselves, connecting all of these different parts, is, I think, extremely powerful, right? And I think that goes back to your discussion of kind of the dichotomy of humans and how we do have this yin and yang and the feminine and the masculine, and there's all of these different aspects. But I think we can even look at it in a more multidimensional way where there's it broader than just dichotomies. There's all these different pieces. How do we keep that flow in moving? And that, I don't know, that those are just thoughts that are popping up as you're talking about self-love and how when our circuit is working appropriately, how much better we are able to meet someone else in flow, right? And other communities in flow. So I'm so glad you continued to tug on that thread, because I think that's extremely important. You are also talking about how the ways that we make ourselves small. And a little bit earlier in your discussion of your own story, you were talking about how a big part of how we're taught to make ourselves small has to do with our gender as women, right? That women are certainly taught to make themselves smaller for the men in our lives, for other people in communities. Talk to me a little bit about the deconstructing of that for you and what that has been like.
Okay. Well, it's been gradual and over time. But one of the first things that I feel like I want to offer is that I have come to believe, as I've learned, as science has proven, that epigenetic trauma exists, and that which means that we all carry in our DNA the traumas of our ancestors and of the past. And, you know, depending what your belief system might be, that doesn't necessarily have to mean that you have direct descendants in the burning times. Right? But what it has led me to believe, I've long questioned why patriarchy is so intractable and why it's so universal around the world. I mean, I just read a New York Times story that said that witch hunting is still happening in India, you know, and it was devastating to me and so painful.
Yeah.
But, you know, people have a propensity for finding blame for when things aren't going right. And for a kind of tribalism. And so I believe that the traumas and the biases of the burning times are actually alive in probably every person alive on the planet today. And that has helped me to remove the overlay of, masculine, feminine as polarities.
Right.
And instead to really consider, really I see my framework that I've been using I call it full spectrum leadership. And, you know, for me, full spectrum leadership means I want to be able to draw from anywhere on the spectrum of feminine to masculine human qualities, and also spiritual, embodied, heart wisdom, all the other places that our society has tended to devalue in terms of our ways of knowing. That I think, you know, the life I want to live integrates all of my ways of knowing. And so I would say, in direct answer to your question, Reese, that over time it has been a freeing. It has been a very liberatory experience to peel away layers of conditioning. And, you know, I'll tell you one of the most recent ones, just to give it a concrete example, is for years and years, my husband is a brilliant writer and has been since he was in grade school. And so I have always deferred to him in the writing realm. And when I first started speaking at Pioneers, he was kind of my role model. So I started writing for speaking and then reading it from a podium at the stage. And of course, as I've had years and years of facilitation experience, I've come to trust more and more that my presence when I'm not reading is actually much more influential and much stronger than when I am reading. And so this past year, I literally had an experience where someone suggested to me that I introduce two people who are incredible mentors and role models to me without reading their introductions. And it was so scary for me to do that, but it was also so liberating. Yeah. And I felt like it helped me peel away that layer of conditioning that said, you have to read when you're doing public speaking.
Right.
Not so anymore. I can trust what's in me and what comes through me in a deeper way.
Right.
Yeah.
I love that. So it really, please don't let me put words in your mouth, but it sounds like it is this kind of ongoing process of peeling these layers back, peeling the conditions back as you go, as you comport through the world, trying to become more authentic in that way as you go, trying to become the highest version of yourself with peeling these layers away.
You know, the way that I think about it, Reese, is that it's a simultaneous effort of peeling away and cultivating. And so anyone who's gardening or has gardened knows that you have to be constantly weeding, right?
Yep.
In order for the plants you're cultivating to really thrive. And so, you know, there are exercises in the book on how to compost things that you want to give back to the earth, that you're done with. You know, this is the layers of conditioning. I think of it often as an onion skin. And at the same time, I am cultivating myself toward who I most admire. Who are the role models and the mentors, and what are the qualities in myself that I want to strengthen? And doing both at the same time, so that I'm growing more and more into the instrument I was born to become.
Absolutely. There's really no building up without clearing away, or taking something away without something moving to fill its place, right? Because all these energies push up against each other. So it's that constant movement. I absolutely love that. And thank you for offering that. I have a few more questions before we dive into some final questions to round us out. One of them is, in this kind of process, talking about this simultaneous exchange between growth and clearing away. There's a moment in your book where you talk about, here it is, it relates a little bit back to this idea of making ourselves smaller and not letting ourselves show up in this whole way. Can you talk a little bit more about how you've been able to shift from this place of diminishing and place of lack into more of an energy of abundance and resonance?
Well, sure. I mean, I think the best way I know to offer that is to give examples.
Sure.
You know, there was a moment early in my process where I realized that when I got out of the shower in the morning, I had all these voices go off in my head about my butt being too big, or my hips being too wide, or my belly being too round, or, you know. And I realized, oh my gosh, I am doing violence to myself every single day. I have to stop this.
Yeah.
And so I invented a ritual. And this is perhaps a good time to offer the 9 words of wisdom that have been so essential to my process, which are consciousness creates matter, language creates reality, ritual creates relationship. And I was gifted that by a Peruvian teacher named Oscar Miro Quesada. And I have leaned on it all kinds of ways. And so in this case, I made up a ritual, and I took a skin oil that I liked, and I infused it with essential oils that felt like they gave me energy and that I loved, and made this skin oil so that each morning after I got out of the shower, I would oil my skin with this wonderfully scented oil, and it only took 2-3 minutes.
Sure.
But as I did it, I would pour love into my body. I would thank it for all the ways that it supports and sustains me. I would thank it for its gifts. And I would literally just be intentionally loving to this, you know, sack of water and organs that's holding my spirit and purpose and heart and everything.
Right. That allows you to be this instrument.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, there are lots of rituals that I have made up over the years to help me stop judging myself and learn to appreciate myself and get more realistic about my gifts and my weaknesses, and not have them be a source of embarrassment or shame, but rather a realistic assessment, because I have amazing gifts and I also have some pretty bad blind spots, and those things inform me about who I need to partner with and how, and they're invaluable.
Absolutely.
And then at the same time, I think, for me, one of the greatest learnings from 20 years of convening women was no wonder the patriarchy has set us up to be in catfights with each other, because women's capacity to reflect and strengthen and accelerate each other's learning is awesome and amazing. And so, I am a great advocate of women's circles, or at least intimate women friends who you can turn to and say, this is how I think I am, but tell me how you perceive me.
Right.
Because, as you were saying, Reese, it's the bridge of love between self and other is about accepting someone else in their difference from yourself, in their full difference. And I think part of the transformation that we're all a part of is going from seeing difference as scary to seeing difference as a virtue.
Yes.
And diversity as a virtue.
Yeah.
Because in nature, it's the ecosystems with the greatest diversity that have the greatest resilience and adaptability to survive and thrive. And we are a subset of nature, of course. So what's true in nature is true for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is so powerful. And I think you sharing that example goes back to something you said at the top of the podcast, that this journey and of growth really does come with this element of self-awareness, and that you were able to recognize this moment that you're like, I'm actually doing harm to myself, that takes this moment of self-awareness. So there's that piece, but then there's also this piece of, now how am I intentionally going to put love back on top of that so that I can work through that? And now how can that make me better serve others? And it really brings, I think, our entire conversation full circle. My last question, based on your book, going off of this idea that we're beginning working towards seeing difference as virtue, as power, as instrumental to understanding our community, our world, ourselves, other people. Towards the end of your book, in the section about trauma, rupture, and repair, you have a quote that just absolutely struck me. So I really just want to call attention to it and then pick your brain a little bit about where you were at writing this. But you were discussing with a group of women who were talking about all these different traumas, and you said that you realized that you really needed to work on focusing on feeling injustice, not just thinking about it. And as a white woman who wants to do a lot of good, right? And I think a lot of people can relate to wanting to do a lot of good. But also we're fallible, we're human, we're falling short. And there are experiences that I am never going to be able to understand, right? That they will just not be my experience in the body that I live in. I had never thought about it framed in this way, that thinking about it is quite different from feeling about it. So I just really wanted to call attention to that and hear a little bit more about what that means for you and what it meant as you wrote it.
Well, it brings up two different essays in the book for me. And, one was this pivotal moment that I describe in some detail in the book, where there was an African-American environmental justice leader who arrived at our very rural retreat and announced that she had asthma and had forgotten to bring her inhaler. And I didn't have a lot of experience with asthma, and neither did my co-facilitator. And as a result, we didn't quite know what to do or how to prepare or how seriously to take it. So on one of the last days, after I had really kind of fallen in love with this woman and become a deep admirer of her courage and her stand and her commitment, and on the last night we had a dance party, and we all went to bed exhausted and sweaty and happy. And at 3 a.m, we were awoken by her roommate saying, "She's having an asthma attack. I don't know what to do. Please come help." And so what I describe, I'm going to try to abbreviate this, but it's all in the book, is that I went into her room and because my mind didn't know what to do, I dropped into my body instinctively for instructions. And I had this profound experience of getting instruction after instruction and doing them. And eventually, and I have no idea whether what I did had anything to do with it or not.
Sure.
But eventually her breathing slowed and it was clear that she was not going to die. And I sank down to the floor by her bed and I had tears streaming down my face.
Yeah.
And I realized that no matter how long I had known about the increased incidence of heart disease and asthma among communities of color, where polluting factories are most often cited, I had known about them from the distance that my privilege afforded me. Mm-hmm. And it was as if that experience pierced the shell of privilege that had grown around my heart. And I never, and I actually spoke that experience and told that story at a Billionaires Conference, which was one of the scariest things I've ever done. And afterward, in the years that followed, I had numerous women of color come to me and say, "I saw that talk that you gave online, and I decided I could trust you because of it." Which was a profound experience. And, there's another story that I tell that's related but different, where at an earlier place in that week-long intensive deep dive that we did, a different group of women all spoke about the traumas that their ancestors had experienced. And because we wound up having 30 to 50% women of color in those trainings, there was a huge diversity of, a woman whose grandmother's feet had been bound, and one who'd been in an internment camp, and, slavery, and all the things that so many humans on Earth today have experienced in their ancestry. And after hearing all those stories, there was a heaviness in the room, because we could all feel empathically, wow, that's a lot of pain. And what we wound up doing was co-inventing a ritual where we went out and we found a branch with lots of branches coming off of it, and we made like little prayer wishes on colored pieces of paper, and we tied them up onto all the branches, and we made a fire. And together that night, we sent all of our prayers into the fire and released them to the spirit world. And it was a very beautiful way of coming together after something that could have driven us apart. That doing this embodied ritual together shifted the energy very dramatically.
Yeah.
And, I've just come to realize that in this work to address a society that is so grossly unequal, it's the actions that we take that matter. It's not what we think, it's not what we know, it's where we show up and how, And so I would offer that with humility and generosity and in true service.
Right, absolutely. And before I round out with the final questions I have for you, I do want to acknowledge that, in this conversation, we are two women who are coming to it with privilege. So, of course, this is just our perspective. So, final two questions. One, is there anything that we missed that, in light of our conversation, you want to clarify, add something onto, something that we haven't touched on that you feel called to speak? This is kind of open time to make sure that if there's anything on your heart that you feel you need to say, this is the time to do so.
Well, thank you, Reese. I think, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that I think this feels like a really meaty conversation, and like we've covered a lot of really important ideas, and I'm really grateful to you for that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And, what I've realized is this is a hard time to be trying to get a book out into the world. And so I've really disengaged from whether people buy the book or not. If you go to the bioneers.org/NCS book URL, then you can download a free introduction to the book. And you can also sign up for the Bioneers newsletter, which will give you access to this whole world of incredibly inspiring media that's, in this time where so much of what we're exposed to is depressing and debilitating and disempowering. Bioneers has the opposite effect. And so lastly, my spirit impulse is a very generous one. And so it's in that vein that I offer Bioneers up, and also my own website, which is ninasimons.com, and where I think all of the podcasts that I've been doing are listed, and also where I'm teaching, because I'm going to be teaching in August a course on sacred activism that I'm really excited about, and with a fellow teacher who I adore and is amazing. And that's all I would add. And thank you, Reese.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that and making sure people have as much access to you and the wonderful work you do as possible. My final question to tie a bow on our conversation here today is, I just ask for one word that would describe how you feel right now.
Thankful. Yeah.
That is perfect. That is all I need. Nina, thank you so much. I'm going to echo your word, thankful, for your time, your energy, your service, for being here and having this conversation with me. I deeply appreciate it, and I'm thankful that our paths got to cross.
Me too. And as a friend recently reminded me, the medicine for grievance is gratitude. So may we all practice gratitude in our lives. And big thanks and deep appreciation to you, Miss Reese, and to everyone listening.
Of course, you too. I will let you go and hopefully talk with you soon.
I hope so.
Thank you all so much for being here today. And I want to thank Nina again for being here and sharing her story. Again, please check out Nina's book, Nature, Culture, and the Sacred, A Woman Listens for Leadership. I'm sure you can tell in the episode that I deeply enjoyed it, and I think you really will too. I would love for you to be a part of this conversation, so please share your thoughts on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, or LinkedIn, all at The Cohere Collective. And if you would like, you can follow me on Instagram at Lillian Reese Brown. If you want to hear even more of my thoughts about today's episode, subscribe to our newsletter on thecoherecollective.com to catch the blog post coming out this Friday. Please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and if you feel so inclined, please leave an honest review or rating. This is really the number one way to support me and the Cohere Collective in making meaning and the work we're doing, and hopefully reach other people who will resonate with this content. Sharing the pod is also a really great way to help support the podcast and start really good conversations with important people in your life. Thank you to Podington Bear for making Meanings theme music and Nicole Ostreicher for making Meanings art and podcast cover. You can find Nicole's work on Instagram at Nicole O Creates or at Nicole O Design. Right now, I am feeling rejuvenated. I just came back from a lovely vacation that was truly life-changing, and getting back to work and returning to the day in, day out choices of making meaning in our everyday life has been powerful for me after vacation. So I've really enjoyed spending this time with you all here today, and I'm looking forward to the next time. Thank you for being here, and hopefully I will see y'all next time. Love.